1982, February 17, Leningrad, USSR. The snow comes in sideways sheets, slapping faces and turning eyelashes. Outside grocery store, no. 24. The queue is already a rope, twisting along the wall, around the corner, and into the morning. Galina Morozova, 36, bookkeeper, mother, squeezes her string bag like it might keep her from being swept away. She has rubles in her purse. She has coupons in her coat. She has one problem that rubles can't solve. The shelves have been empty for days. At noon, a whisper rippled through her office like electricity. Butter's coming. Then a second whisper, sharper, maybe sausage. By 2 o'clock, people were going to check something and not returning. Galina left early and ran. Not a jog, a run. Past trams, past icicles, past men stamping their feet for warmth. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was being calm. Her stomach did not believe her. The line barely moves. A pensioner up front yells, 2 kilos each. Someone answers, only if the truck arrives. A woman behind Galina repeats the rumor for the 5th time, as if repetition makes it true. A man in a leather cap leans in, close breath, smelling of tobacco. I heard the shipment went to Moskovsky district. They always send the good stuff there. He says it like a fact, like a verdict. Galina looks at the storefront window. Behind the glass, the store is warm, yellow lit, and strangely still. No stacks of bread, no pyramids of apples, just a clerk and a few tired shoppers moving like ghosts. If food was cheap, why does it feel like a chase? A teenager slides along the edge of the queue, whispering, I can hold your place. His palm is open, 5 rubles. People glare, some look away. A few reach for their wallets anyway. Galina hears a new sound, and it's worse than the rumors. A whistle, sharp, official. 2 militia officers step onto the sidewalk, scanning the crowd as if the line itself is guilty. The whispers die. Shoulders stiffen, hands disappear into pocket. Someone mutters, they're checking ration cards. Galina's ration booklet is in her coat, right there. It's stamped, it's valid. Still, her throat tightens. In this city, in this winter, you don't fear hunger the way you fear trouble. Trouble can take your job, trouble can take your future. The door opens for a heartbeat. Warm air spills out. A clerk shouts, close for inventory, and slams it shut again. Inventory. In a store that looks empty, the line groans like one animal. People surge forward anyway, angry at physics, angry at time, angry at each other. Galina is pushed. Her foot slips on packed snow. Her bag swings and knocks the pensioner's cane. Then, from inside, a crash, glass, a shout. The door flies open. The crowd surges. Galina is carried with it, chest to back, breath stolen. She sees the militia pushing toward the entrance. She sees the clerk's face, pale, furious, pointing toward a back room. And on the floor, near the counter, she sees them. Little rectangles of paper, coupons, ration slips, scattered like fallen leaves. A hand grabs a handful. Another hand slaps it away. The militia officer barks something. Galina's mind flashes one thought, clean and terrifying. What if her coupons are in that pile? What if her name is about to vanish? Cut to black. On paper, the USSR had cheap food. Bread for kopecks, milk for pennies, meat at official prices that seemed frozen in time. So why were people always hungry? Why did dinner depend on whisper, not wages? Here's the first trap. The price tag was not the price. In the Soviet system, prices were set by the state. The idea was protective. If essentials stay affordable, everyone eats. But a low posted price can hide other costs, the kind you don't see on a receipt. Time, stress, uncertainty, favors, fear. Ask yourself, if a loaf costs 20 kopecks but takes 3 hours of standing, is it still cheap? And if everyone can afford meat at the official price, but there isn't enough meat, what happens next? In most market systems, a shortage pushes the price up. Painful, yes, but informative. Higher prices tell producers, make more, and tell consumers, use less or switch. The adjustment is ugly, but it is a signal. In the planned economy, the signal was muted. Prices were often held steady for years. Instead of rationing by money, the system rationed by access, by the queue, by the rumor, by who could leave work without being punished, by who had the stamina to stand in winter, by who knew somebody. Is that equality or a different kind of inequality? When prices are held below what supply can support, demand doesn't politely stay in line. Demand attacks. Not because people are greedy, but because scarcity teaches a brutal lesson. If you see it, grab it now. This is why Soviet shoppers hoarded when something appeared. Butter shows up, buy butter. Sugar shows up, buy sugar. Even if you don't need it today, because tomorrow the shelves may be bare again. Economists call the rubles people couldn't spend repressed inflation. People called it simpler. Money is useless. So the paradox grows. Low prices create high pressure. The shop becomes a battlefield, not a marketplace. And supply wasn't just low, it was unpredictable. Factories and distribution networks were judged by planned targets, monthly, quarterly, yearly. Managers learned to storm near deadlines, pushing output in sudden bursts to meet quotas. The result wasn't a steady river of food. It was a flood, then a drought. 1 week, no sausage anywhere. Next week, a pile of sausage for 40 minutes. Then, nothing again. So rumors weren't superstition. They were a coping technology. If information is scarce, gossip becomes logistics. But the plan had another problem: incentives. If you pay people to hit a number, they hit the number. They don't necessarily solve the human need behind it. A meat plant might be judged by kilograms, not taste. A dairy might be judged by liters, not freshness. A bakery might be judged by output, not whether the bread is still soft tomorrow. If the target is weight, you can add water. If the target is volume, you can dilute. If the target is pieces, you can shrink quality and keep counting. Who pays for that? The person at home, cutting around gristle and scraping mold off bread? And then there's spoilage, the silent thief. Food is not steel. It doesn't like waiting. It bruises, sours, leaks, rots. In a system where transport is overloaded and storage is underbuilt, time becomes an enemy. A cabbage can be harvested perfectly and still die on a rail siding. A fish can be caught fresh and arrive stinking. Milk can be produced on schedule and sour in a warm truck. A slow pan across metal racks, bare except for dust and a single lonely jar. Soviet distribution had bottlenecks everywhere. Trucks broke down. Spare parts were scarce. Refrigeration failed. Warehouses were cramped. Rail priorities shifted toward heavy industry or military need. Food moved, but not smoothly. And when food arrived in bad condition, store workers faced a choice: put it out and be screamed at, or write it off, quietly diverting the best pieces to friends, colleagues, and the people who could make their lives easier. This is where cheap food acquired a shadow: the second economy. The second economy wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 small solutions. A butcher who keeps meat in the back. A warehouse clerk who can find an extra carton. A driver who diverts a few kilos off a shipment. A cafeteria cook who trades sausage for coffee. A neighbor who swaps sugar coupons for potatoes. Some of it was theft. Some of it was barter. Some of it was bribery. Much of it felt, to ordinary people, like survival. But it created a new hierarchy. Not of cash, of connections. Who can solve a problem for you? Who owes you a favor? Who can get you oranges in winter? If food was truly affordable for all, why did a phone call matter more than a paycheck? Privilege made the gap wider. The USSR had special distribution channels, closed canteens, workplace supply systems, and special stores for certain categories of people. Party officials, senior managers, key researchers, the military, and others could access goods that ordinary citizens could only dream about. Sometimes it wasn't luxury. Sometimes it was reliability. Reliability is a luxury when everyone else lives by it. So what did cheap mean in practice? But cheap also had a literal meaning inside the state's books. The official retail price was often below the real cost of producing the food. The difference didn't disappear. The government covered it with subsidies, moving money from elsewhere to keep the price sign low. So the question becomes, cheap for whom? Cheap for the buyer at the counter, yes. Expensive for the budget. And when budgets strain, something gets sacrificed, usually the invisible systems that keep food edible. Refrigerated trucks, spare parts, packaging, warehouses, fuel. The boring infrastructure that prevents milk from souring and cabbage from rotting. Starve the boring parts, and the exciting parts, meat, butter, bread, start to fail in ways no poster can fix. Bread was politically dangerous. A rise in bread prices could trigger unrest, so bread stayed cheap and abundant longer than other goods. People filled gaps with more chleb, more starch, less protein, fewer vitamins. Full stomach, slow hunger. Now add meat. Meat isn't just food, it's a status signal. When meat appears, everyone wants it because meat means you're not scraping by. Demand concentrates on the hardest product to supply. Raising livestock requires feed grain. Feed grain competes with bread grain. The plan could order more meat, but it couldn't decree away biology. Animals take time. Herds take years. Feed takes harvests. So managers met today's target by stealing from tomorrow, slaughtering young animals, pushing weight fast, borrowing feed, and leaving the future thinner. This is one reason shortages felt permanent. Output could spike for a report, then collapse back into deficit. Agriculture also had a split personality. On collective and state farms, effort and reward were separated by paperwork. The harvest went to procurement. The worker's incentive was weak and distant. But on private household plots, tiny gardens behind a house, a dacha patch, a few chickens, effort and reward were immediate. Weed today, eat tomorrow. That simple link did more than slogans ever did. Why would a few square meters outperform thousands of hectares? Because incentives are fertilizer. When official channels failed, city families leaned on those plots, on relatives in villages, on paiski, trips to the countryside with empty bags, and return trains filled with potatoes. The plan struggled with geography too. Supplying Moscow and Leningrad was a political priority. They were showcase cities. Food often flowed to the center first. What about smaller towns, factory settlements, places off the main lines? There, cheap food could mean nothing at all. The deficit had a word people used like a curse, deficit, not a temporary inconvenience, a category of life. You couldn't choose products. You took what appeared. No beef, maybe fish. No fish, maybe tinned sprats. No sprats, maybe cabbage soup. Again, choice is a luxury you only notice after it's gone. Queues also tax time unevenly. If you had access to a closed canteen, you ate. If you had a strict shift, you couldn't leave to stand in line. Often the burden fell on women and pensioners, the ones whose time the system treated as cheap. So cheap food came with a hidden tax on the powerless. And still, when supplies failed, control increased. More coupon, more stamps, more Proverki inspection. Sometimes militia appeared, not to bring food, but to manage the anger around food. When a society can't supply enough butter, it supplies more paperwork. So when you hear cheap, imagine two parallel economies. One is printed on price lists. The other is lived in hours, favors, and fear. People had a name for the connection game too. Blat. A phone call, a favor, a small gift, suddenly sausage appeared. Without blat, you wait. With blat, the price stayed low. Access became the real currency in town. It meant the official price was low. It meant the state subsidized essentials. It meant the cashier rang up a small number. And then it meant you paid the rest in other currencies. Time, stress, favors, and loss of dignity. Here's a simple analogy. A price is like a traffic light at a busy intersection. Green means go, there's space ahead. Red means stop, the road is crowded. Without anyone meeting, without speeches, the light coordinates thousands of decisions. Now imagine the light is stuck on green forever. Cars pour in, the intersection clogs, people honk, tempers rise, somebody climbs out of a car, somebody throws a punch. Eventually, the street stops moving not because nobody wants to drive, but because the signal failed. Frozen prices were a green light that never turned red. Shortage didn't disappear. It just changed shape. So the system rationed anyway, just not through money. It rationed through queues, through coupons, through privilege networks, through the second economy, through sheer endurance. Do you see the twist? Cheap food didn't eliminate scarcity. It relocated scarcity into everyday life where it could grind people down quietly. Now, return to Leningrad. Return to Galina. Inside grocery store No. 24, the Vozdukh is warm and smells like wet wool, vinegar, and exhausted anger. The crash was a crate of pickles tipping over, jars shattering across tile. A clerk is shouting at someone behind the counter. Who opened the back door? The militia officer steps forward, jaw tight. Everyone, calm down, one at a time. No one is calm. Galina squeezes her ration booklet in her palm. The woman ahead of her reaches the counter and slides her booklet forward like a passport. The clerk flips it open, stamps a square, and places 2 pale bricks of butter on the counter. Butter exists. The rumor was real. A wave of relief hits the crowd, and then instantly a wave of fear. Because relief is fragile here. The clerk raises his voice. Meat shipment delayed. Only butter today. Only until the coupons run out. Until the coupons run out. Not until the butter runs out. Galina's mind snaps backward a week. Her neighbor had knocked on her door with purple fingers from cold. "Please," the neighbor said. "I need potatoes for my mother. I'll trade you butter coupons." Potatoes were gone everywhere. Galina's son was coughing. She agreed. It seemed reasonable. Potatoes now, butter later. But later has arrived. Galina flips to February's butter page and feels her stomach drop. The square is already stamped. Used. Gone. She steps to the counter anyway. She has rubles. She has hope. She has a mother's stubbornness. The clerk looks once and shakes his head. No coupon, no butter. Galina hears the words like a sentence. Behind her, the crowd presses closer, impatient, suspicious. A man mutters, "Move." Someone else hisses, "She's trying something." The militia officer glances at her hands. Not cruel, not kind, just watching. Galina's face burns. She wants to say, "The price is low, I can pay." She wants to say, "My son needs this." She wants to say, "What kind of system sells food to paper, not people?" But she says nothing. Because in this place, arguing can cost more than butter. Then a hand touches her sleeve. It's the student with red ears from the line. He doesn't look at her. He slides a small strip of paper into her palm. A butter coupon. He whispers, "My aunt is sick. She won't use it." Galina stares at the paper. Thin, official, ridiculously powerful. A key cut from cardboard. She pushes it across the counter. The clerk stamps. 2 bricks of butter land with a dull thud. Galina grabs them and backs away as if she's stolen something. Heart racing, shame mixing with gratitude. Outside, the queue is still there. The rumor will evolve. Butter came, but only for those with coupons. Meat didn't. Come tomorrow. Come earlier. Bring friends. Bring luck. Galina walks home through blowing snow. No sausage, no meat, just butter, and the knowledge that her next meal depended on a stranger's mercy. So, back to the big question. If food was cheap, why did it cost hours of your life? If the state promised abundance, why did people live by whispers? If quotas were met on paper, why did mothers bargain with coupons? If everyone was equal, why did connections taste better than ideology? If the price never moved, what else had to move? The answer is not one villain. It's a system of incentives and information. When prices are frozen, they stop telling the truth about scarcity. When managers are punished for failure, they hide problem. When quotas reward volume, quality suffers. When transport and storage lag, spoilage rises. When shops can't satisfy demand, the second economy blooms. When privilege networks exist, trust collapses. And when trust collapses, people stop shopping and start hunting. On screen, simple graph. A flat line labeled official prices sits calm, while a jagged line labeled real cost, time plus stress, spikes upward like a heartbeat. In that world, cheap doesn't mean accessible. It means unpredictable. It means you might have money and still go home empty. It means your calendar becomes a ration card. It means your dignity is negotiated one queue at a time. The haunting part is this: scarcity is always paid for. If not with money, then with something else. In Leningrad, February 1982, the ruble wasn't always what bought dinner. Sometimes it was a rumor, sometimes it was a stamp, sometimes it was a favor, and sometimes it was nothing. Cheap on the label, costly in the lungs.